Hello! If you know me from TikTok or you came from my TikTok page, it's nice to see you here. You are probably unsurprised by the length of this video because if you know me, you know that I can't shut up. But for those of you that don't know me, hello again, my name is Jay, yes, like the letter, and I am someone who cannot like things a normal amount. And that's how I end up making things like these. I don't think I should waste any more time, so let's get into it. The Red Dead Redemption series has a lot of themes present throughout its stories. Loyalty, faith, family, revenge, morality, redemption, the list could go on. A lot of these themes are at the forefront of the story while it's told. What about the background themes? The stories found in campfire tales or passing conversations outside of the main story. This overarching theme that's present with nearly every character and presents itself in almost every interaction. There's a lot to discuss when it comes to our two protagonists that we as the player get to control and watch as we follow their lives. But it's bigger than them even. When you get down to it and overanalyze everything like I do, a big theme that presents itself in the Red Dead Redemption series is the topic of fatherhood. The first Red Dead Redemption definitely lends itself to this theme. It would be impossible to talk about this game and not discuss fatherhood. It's intrinsic not only to the plot, but to the very character of John Marston. Fatherhood is tied into the fabric of this game in nearly every way. It's John's driving force. It's his primary concern throughout everything that happens. Conversely, fatherhood presents itself much more subtly in the second game. Arthur Morgan has such a subtle relationship with fatherhood that it almost goes undiscussed entirely. The effects of this relationship become most evident when, in the final chapter of the game, our protagonist is met with the morality and consequences of his actions. Despite its brevity and, quite frankly, lack of detail, we still get to see how fatherhood has had a lasting impact on him. And not only are our protagonists fathers themselves, but it's their relationships to the father figures and mentors in their life that are also important to this conversation. Knowing how these characters were raised is a huge factor. Arthur and John's biological fathers might be somewhat of a mystery just from the lack of detail, but we have no shortage of examples when it comes to Dutch and Hosea. Their influence is arguably the entire reason why these games even happen in the first place. And when they've helped shape the outlook and mentality of our protagonists, it would be a disservice to leave them out of this conversation. But our protagonists and their influences aren't the only ones in this conversation either. As we go through the events of the Red Dead Redemption series, we encounter many fathers and sons, each one with their own story. Some of these are friends, some of these are unfortunate souls whose lives happen to entangle with the main story. Even our antagonists have a complicated relationship with fatherhood that can serve as some kind of explanation for the behavior we see. Fatherhood may not be as prominent as some of the other themes in these stories. It's not in the title like redemption is, but it's one of those underlying realities that can present itself in even the littlest of interactions. It's a constant that influences nearly every character we come across in some way. So, let's talk about it. Let's go chronologically here and talk about Arthur Morgan first. Arthur's time as a father is one that we really don't have a lot of detail about. The most we know is he had a son named Isaac, who he had with a waitress that he met at one time, and he talks about this as if it were a lifetime ago. There's an insinuation here that the pregnancy was unexpected after a one-night fling, but beyond that, we know little else. Arthur claims to come around every few months to visit Isaac and Eliza, which tells us that he wasn't actively living with or helping raise Isaac, though he promised to do right by them, whatever that entailed. Both Arthur and Eliza understood that his way of life meant that being a present father was kind of a difficult thing to ask. Despite not being around often, Arthur still talks very positively about his son. Even still, we don't really know how close the two were. Hell, we don't even know how old Isaac was. The only other bit of information that Arthur gives up is the tragic end that both Eliza and Isaac met. Victims of a robbery turned violent, the two were already buried by the time Arthur had come around again. The unfortunate passing of his son and the mother of his child is something that clearly still affects him by the time we see him in 1899. He expresses upset when he explains their deaths. One of his lines in this conversation always stuck out to me.
But I know now that you don't get to live a bad life and have good things happen to you.
Obviously, the good thing here being the family that he had. There's certainly a larger conversation here about all of the regret and guilt that Arthur goes through in chapter 6, but in the context of this video, I just want to point out that Arthur has been raised by outlaws, primarily thieves, his entire life. And we'll get into a conversation about all of that later. For now, I just want to say that I think it would sit heavy with Arthur knowing that he, as a criminal and a thief, lost both his son and the mother of his child to a violent robbery. What could he have done if he did live with them? Could he have protected them if he would have come around more often? Regardless of whether or not Arthur actually feels any guilt over their deaths, it's clear that the pain of losing Isaac and Eliza is something that he struggles with for years following the fact. So Arthur's relationship with fatherhood is strained, to say the least. We can see aspects of this struggle most notably in the way he interacts with the Marston family. Little side note here, but I promise it'll all circle back. Arthur writes in his journal at one point that he feels he would have married Abigail had they not both been preoccupied with other people. Controversial, but I do not think that Arthur was actually in love with Abigail. I don't think him questioning if he should have married her before she fell for John came from this place of jealousy or any kind of romantic feelings. I think this is merely him projecting the loss of Isaac and Eliza onto her. Abigail is a young mother, basically a single mother since John wants nothing to do with her or her child at the beginning of the second game, and she got pregnant at around the same time Eliza was said to. Both of them, at young ages, were left with sons to raise who almost never had the father of their child present for help. And while I'd argue that Arthur still did more than John did, for one, he didn't hate his kid, and he had no problem claiming Isaac as his own, so big ups to you, Arthur, I guess. Neither of them were exactly stand-up fathers. Seeing Abigail go through this struggle with her own child made Arthur want to step in and fill that sort of protector or provider role. He wanted to be in that fatherly position, whether he realized it or not. He might begrudgingly refer to himself as a nursemaid when Abigail asks him to take Jack fishing, but he's always very kind to the two of them. In chapter 6, Arthur writes in his journal, "Jack is an innocent little boy. In him, I see what I missed." If you need a more explicit parallel, I don't know what to tell you. Being there for Jack and providing for Abigail is a way for Arthur to fill that void that was left by Isaac and Eliza's passing. That is why he got so involved. It's also part of the reason why Arthur has such animosity for John at the beginning of the second game. There's a few layers to the tension that the two of them have, but for the sake of this video, I'll keep it streamlined to the conversation of fatherhood. It's no secret that Arthur is very critical of the way John acts at the beginning of Red Dead 2. He repeatedly scolds him for not being present in Jack's life, or for failing to provide and protect both Abigail and Jack, who should be able to lean on him for support. And there's a few reasons why John's fabled year-long absence upsets Arthur so much, but Arthur does point out that part of that upset comes from John running off on his own child. The argument that they have during the mission The Sheep and the Goats is pretty much the best summary we get of their entire conflict.
Always playing some goddamn game.
Me? I ain't the one taking Jack on fishing trips.
No, you ain't. If you say the boy ain't yours, what's the difference? You probably only run off again.
Arthur is frustrated seeing John throw away his opportunity at family, and that hurt primarily comes from his own decision to not fully appreciate that opportunity when he had it. He lost his family and then has to watch as John actively chooses to disregard and ignore his own. That has to cut pretty deep. Despite all of his qualms with John, he never gives up on the Marston family. We will fully dive into John's character arc and his change from deadbeat dad to better than that when we get to his chapter, so hold your horses, he'll get his turn. But focusing on Arthur's perspective here, we watch as his priorities shift from protecting Dutch to protecting the more vulnerable members in the gang, including the Marston family. He advocates for the women and children to be let go, for John's family to be allowed to walk free. When John is presumed dead and Abigail is captured, Arthur pleads for Dutch to go back and rescue her just so Jack isn't left an orphan. He tells Sadie that his main priority was, quote, find a way to get John, Abigail, and Jack out of this mess, to give them a life. Hell, the entire ending to the main story of this game is Arthur giving up the last of his energy, strength, valuables to ensure that John stays safe and is able to see his family again. His dying wish is that John make it safely back to Abigail and Jack. One of the last things that Arthur can proclaim with absolute certainty in the face of the two men that betrayed him the most is that John is the true victor out of any of them because he got to be with his family. This is Arthur's redemption. One could argue it was his decisions that led to the demise of his own family. family, albeit in different ways. So dedicating the last of his life to ensuring, or at least trying to help, another family live, one that he saw himself in no less, was the best way to make up for it. He never got to live the life and experience the fatherhood that John did, but it's because of Arthur that John didn't squander that opportunity. But all that being said, Arthur's complicated relationship with fatherhood isn't only explored in the Marston family. Of course, there are layers to Arthur's dynamic with the Downs family, but again, I'm streamlining the conversation here. When we see Edith and her son again in chapter 6, the two are absolutely miserable. They're downtrodden, they're barely scraping by, and this is in part due to Arthur's influence. Again, the guilt that Arthur faces here is multifaceted, but just like we extensively discussed with Abigail and Jack, who's to say Arthur can't see himself in the Downs family as well? Arthur admits to Sister Calderon that he got his tuberculosis, quote, beating a man to death for a few bucks, end quote. And he describes Isaac and Eliza's death as, quote, some bastards had come through, robbed them, and shot him dead, all for $10, end quote. I honestly can't say if this similarity in writing was done intentionally, but I certainly think it's important, especially in the context of chapter 6, in which Arthur starts to face a lot of guilt for his actions. And while we're on the topic of widows in chapter 6, I also want to bring to attention the Londonderrys. Arthur Londonderry, absolutely intentional usage of the name there by the way, has worked himself literally to death trying to pay off his debts, so we're left to collect from his widow. When Arthur arrives, there's a young mother and her son packing up as they're being forced out of their home. In a broader sense, I always felt that this was meant to parallel the way that Arthur shows up to Edith and her son's home after Thomas passes away, but in the context of this video, I just want to point out how Arthur very easily could have shown up to the Londonderry home and left them in the same way that Isaac and Eliza had passed away. Had a different person shown up, had someone with less regrets, less guilt, less morality than he did, show up to collect that debt, it very easily could have ended up the same way. There's an emotional weight that comes from realizing that Arthur has put other families through what he has been through with Isaac and Eliza's death. That pain that he felt, that he talks so negatively about, is something that he has put other families through. And while I'm sure he's had this revelation before, actually witnessing it firsthand, especially again in the context of chapter 6, it just really makes it hit all that harder. He truthfully did not live his life that much different from the men that showed up at Eliza's door that fateful night. Despite the pain of losing his child and the lasting impact that it had on him, Arthur almost never talks about it. But I think that's a pretty important detail in and of itself. The simple fact of never talking about it just goes to show how difficult those emotions are to face. We, as the player, only learn about Isaac and Eliza through a very specific set of interactions that you have to intentionally choose, meaning you can play through this game and never hear about either of them. It makes me wonder how many people around Arthur never knew he was a father either. It would make sense that a man as closed off and reserved as Arthur really wouldn't open up about that kind of thing, even to the people that he slept beside every day and ran with for years. It is not information that he gives up easily. Again, even as we literally control and follow him, we only ever see him talk about his child with two very specific people. It's interesting that these are both people that he just happened to meet pretty recently, but they're both undoubtedly people that have left a lasting impact on him. Sister Calderon is a topic for a different time, I feel, but we'll get into Rain's Fall much later because he is very important in this conversation. For now, though, I think John deserves some time in the spotlight, as he is our most notable father in this series. John's entire arc in the second game revolves around his role as a father and a husband. It is intrinsic to his character, the change he goes through, and the story surrounding him. Even in the first Red Dead Redemption, the entire plot follows his decision to risk his life and re-involve himself in his old way of life so he can protect his family. It is dependent on the fact that John cares about and would do anything for his family, which, if you know anything about early RDR2 John, is a very far cry from the man he used to be. So let's get into it, because I will take every opportunity that I can to make fun of this man and the time that he wasted being a deadbeat dad. We've already discussed, through Arthur's perspective, that John was as absent as he could have been in Jack and Abigail's lives. This man left the gang for an entire year, and while we don't really know why, we do know that he had no problem leaving behind his child. John even denies that Jack is his kid, as if that would absolve him of any kind of responsibility.
There's a fine boy you got.
If he's mine.
Of course he's yours.
And when Abigail begs him to pay attention to their son, to man up and be a father for their boy, he dismisses her and calls it nagging. And while he has the basic human decency to admit that he doesn't have any ill will towards Jack, he does admit that he would kill Abigail if he could.
And if you knew you could kill her and get away with it, you would.
all because she has the audacity to ask that he actually take care of the child he helped create. Now, I do want to point out that at least some of his unwillingness to be a father does seem to come from some sort of insecurity, or at the very least, just plain ignorance. When Abigail begs him to spend time with their child, John often admits that he hasn't got the slightest idea of what it means to be a father. At one point, he even tells her that she deserves so much more than what he can give her. Hashtag truth nuke.
Listen, Abigail, you deserve so much more than I can manage. I guess I just don't know much about fathering.
Oh, it's real easy.
What do I do?
This absolutely does not excuse the terrible way he treats Abigail or how dismissive and cold he is towards Jack, but it might explain some of the hesitance that he has. At least, partly. I think John has this idea that not being present at all is somehow better than being present but having no idea what you're doing. Newsflash, buddy, Abigail has no idea what she's doing either, but she actually has the guts to try. With all of that being said, Arthur and Abigail aren't the only ones to criticize John's lack of involvement. Hosea and Dutch are very vocal about encouraging John to appreciate the family that he has. They don't let him get away with feigning ignorance or acting like he can't be a father for whatever reason.
I don't understand.
Be a man, John. It would suit you.
They both make it a point to remind John how important love and family is, and how, quite frankly, idiotic he is for throwing that opportunity away. Love is the most important thing, they say, and they don't sugarcoat the way they talk to John when they tell him he's being stupid for throwing away the love that his family gives him. Hosea, in particular, even urges John to take his family and leave the gang for their safety. And in a group where loyalty is the most important thing, that's a pretty big deal. Granted, Hosea doesn't preach about loyalty the way that Dutch does, but it's still a pretty big deal that one of the founding members of this gang, and one of the more respected elders of it, is urging John to prioritize his family and just leave the rest of them behind. This life is not safe for a child, and Hosea is, unfortunately, one of only few people to vocalize that. It's a little bit hypocritical of him to say that, I won't lie, but we'll get into that later. Now, with all of that being said, I think it's pretty safe to say that John was not a great father in the early half of Red Dead 2, and we are not fed that information subtly. Arthur, Abigail, Dutch, Hosea, multiple gang members are vocal about John's neglect. Needless to say, if that many people are complaining about a problem, it's a pretty damn big problem. But as the story progresses, we do see John change. Like I said, his entire character arc in the second game revolves around his role as a father and the change he goes through. It's unfortunate that it takes his child being kidnapped by a crime lord for him to realize how much he should care about his kid, but I guess beggars can't be choosers. As John realizes what Abigail and Jack mean to him and how important this family dynamic is, it causes a big shift in his personality. Don't get me wrong, he's still a little wild, and the vocal hesitance he has with Dutch's mindset isn't entirely new, but fatherhood becomes John's purpose. So does being a husband, which for Abigail's sake I don't want to ignore. He goes from living rather selfishly by throwing himself in the face of danger and disregarding all of the people that care about him, to realizing that he wants to continue living for his family. The gang and whatever goals Dutch had at the time was no longer his top priority, especially as these escapades grew riskier and John had to weigh the possibility of maybe getting some money versus losing his life and leaving behind his wife and child. I think it's important to acknowledge that this change John goes through is spurred on by the people who stuck by him the most, the people that continued to care about him despite all of his faults. Yes, John and Arthur would butt heads. Yes, John had a rather unfounded disdain for Abigail in the beginning. Yes, John deliberately ignored Jack at every turn. And it's important to acknowledge all of that. But despite all of his faults, those three loved him. Whether that was for better or for worse is its own debate. But I've always believed it was that stubborn, unwavering dedication that Abigail had for him, that brotherly love that Arthur extended towards him, that helped convince John that his family was more precious than anything else. Arthur's dying wish was for John to carry on living and taking care of his family, and he made sure to honor that. Now, I don't want to ignore how reluctant John is to live a boring life by the time we see him in the second game's epilogue, struggling to abandon that more reckless side of himself despite all of Arthur and Abigail's scolding is exactly what ends his family in a lot of danger later on. But again, the point here is that he tries. Unfortunately, this is a case where I will praise a man for the bare minimum because I do think the fact that John actually makes an effort and tries is a big sign of positive change for him. He is not always successful, mind you. In fact, he fails quite often, everyone point and laugh. But when he does screw up, when Abigail gives him these ultimatums and eventually leaves with their child, John locks in like he never yet has. He works himself into debt with the government. I feel like it's important to emphasize that. An outlaw who has been on the run for most of his life, an avid vocal critic of the government, has now willingly taken on debt with the government and stresses about paying it off, also he can build a home for his family. He has fully accepted and maybe even started to embrace his role as a family man. He's no longer John Marston, son of Dutch and reckless thief. He's John Marston, father, husband, and sheep farmer. Like I said though, this doesn't suddenly mean that he's world's best dad, and I'm sure Jack can attest to that. A lot of their conversations are awkward and forced, to put it simply. John clearly does not know how to connect to his child. I mean, at least he can admit it, I guess. There's a lot of stumbling and misspoken blunder, but he's making an attempt. I'm not gonna fault the guy for being awkward. I am the last person that can fault anybody for that. But that fishing mission with the two of them is just... it's a hard watch. At the very least, we can say he went from scolding Arthur for taking his son on fishing trips to actually manning up and doing it himself. And a lot of this desire to provide and protect, even when he's a bumbling fool who has no idea what to say, extends into the first game. The entire story is pretty much just, look at what lengths John will go to protect his wife and child. We know he's reluctant to involve himself in his old ways. His feelings towards his ex-gangmates are pretty complex, and for good reason, but he barely acknowledges the time that he spent with them, presumably because it's something he'd rather forget. And yet, because his wife and child are at risk, he involves himself. Granted, it's not like he had much choice, but making the difficult decision to face people he hasn't seen in a decade and actively work with the government he despises is still a pretty big deal. Hell, this man goes to a different country and involves himself in their political affairs simply because it might lead him to the person he needs to see his family again. When they do finally reunite, we see John make an effort to be more present with his family. That means being uncomfortable sometimes, having tough conversations and confronting fault and teaching hard lessons. He still hasn't learned how to properly connect with his son, and we learn that it's primarily because, as Jack claims, John is never present. He barely acknowledges Jack's interests, and he comes off pretty dismissive at times. And while it seems to upset John learning that his son perceives him this way, he has grown enough to acknowledge and admit that he's not the greatest father. He makes a point to promise that he won't leave again, that he'll never disappear and leave his son behind. We'll get more into Jack's perspective when we get into his chapter, but there's clearly a reason why he's so hesitant to believe what his father says. It's hard to say how exactly John feels about this disconnect, considering he doesn't verbalize a lot of his thoughts in the first game, but I think it's fair to assume it probably doesn't feel great. One thing I will give him credit for, though, is that he doesn't run away from the problem anymore. Jack is his son, and he is very proud of his boy. Their dynamic is, no doubt, very complicated, very complex, but I have no doubt that there is a lot of love that underlies it. Little tangent before we wrap up this chapter. It's in a conversation with Bonnie McFarland that we learned that John and Abigail actually had a daughter at some point between 1907 and 1911. Unfortunately, he tells us that she's passed, and because of the time frame, we know that she can't have been very old. But this small detail that was admittedly probably meant to be a throwaway line is honestly pretty important in this conversation. The same man who didn't want to accept his own son because of the responsibility it forced upon him has now willingly had another child with the woman that he loves. It's such a small detail in the grand scheme of these stories, but I think it says so much about John's role as a father. Saying that John has changed a lot from 1899 to 1911 is a huge understatement. I don't really think there's enough words to properly explain it, but if you know the story, you know what I mean. Fatherhood is such an intrinsic part to John's character arc, and his role as a father is very important to who he is and the story surrounding him. Even when he's not good at it, even when he doesn't know what to say or he struggles to keep his gun holstered. It is not a perfect life by any means, but I want to reiterate the importance of trying.
Maybe we can change, but we gotta try, for Jack's sake, even if we have to start again 100 times. Better than going back to what we were.
26-year-old John ignored Jack and Abigail at every opportunity he got, even denied that Jack was his own child. 38-year-old John worked with the government that he avidly hated and threatened the lives of anyone who dared mention his wife and child in a bad light. That is a huge difference, and a very important one at that. Why is it that being a father is so substantial to these men? I think it's important to factor in the time period when we have this conversation. In 1899, most, if not all, men were expected to have children, and that was primarily for the legacy factor. You had to pass along your bloodline, or your genes, or any kind of, assets and property you had. This isn't unique to the 19th century, or even America for that matter. Men have had this expectation to pass along the family name for so long. But if I'm honest, I don't really think that this was a huge influence in either of our protagonists. Like we previously discussed, we really don't have a ton of details surrounding Isaac, so we'll never really know Arthur's more complicated thoughts about his son. All we do know is what's implied through conversation, or his treatment of other people. So no, I can't say for sure whether or not Arthur intended to pass along the Morgan bloodline with his kid. Considering it was an unintentional pregnancy and he rarely came around, my bet is lineage was not the top of his priorities, especially at that time. But even more damning is what we see in the conflict between Arthur and John over Jack. Never once does Arthur propose the idea that John needs to claim his son or be there and take care of his son because, hey man, that's your bloodline. You need to secure your lineage. He just wanted the kid to have a decent father. That was really all that mattered. And when we look at John's story as a whole, it's honestly a pretty similar case. He didn't even want his child at first, so I find it kind of hard to believe that he would really care about what the societal expectations were of fathers at that time. Perhaps it was something he thought about much later, after he started to accept his role as a father, but we really don't have any proof of that. A lot of the concern that John seemed to have for his son was ensuring that he was safe. The closest we could maybe get is the fact that John brings up that one day Jack will take over the family's ranch, but yeah, that's how assets work. It doesn't really read like concern for the family name or continuing the Marston legacy. Abigail might have been more than happy to take on his name, but I really never took John for someone who cared very much about his family legacy, and I think that's most evident in the events of the first game. I find it hard to believe that a man trying so hard to distance himself from the events that are tied to his name would be very concerned about his son carrying on the lineage. I, for one, would like to think that John actually cared more about raising a child who was actually cared for and protected, rather than just some kind of vessel that carried on his name. And a lot of my opinion stems from our protagonist's experience on the other side of the coin, as the sons of their fathers. Just as Arthur and John's fatherhood is an important factor to consider, so is their childhood. Knowing their upbringing and the relationships that they had, particularly with their fathers, explains a lot about their own struggles being fathers. Our knowledge of their biological parents is pretty limited, but with the knowledge we do know, we know they did not have the most ideal of upbringings. Saying Arthur's relationship with his father is complicated is a gross oversimplification. We know his father, Lyle, was a petty criminal whom Arthur did not have the fondest memories of. And while having a criminal for a father doesn't necessarily damn you for the rest of your life, it is dangerous. And that cycle of criminality and violence is easier to fall into the younger you're introduced to it. Not to mention, it's said that Lyle was physically abusive, which would only exacerbate the cycle of violence. And obviously it messes you up, especially as a child. Through conversations we hear in-game, we learn that Arthur witnessed his father's death sometime before the age of 14. And no matter how you feel about your parents, that's something that I don't imagine anyone would get over easily. And we see that in the way that Arthur carries parts of his father 20 years later. He has a picture of his father that he displays at every camp he sets up at, and the hat he wears once belonged to his father. I won't pretend that I can even begin to understand the layers and layers of complexity with Arthur and Lyle's relationship. But knowing what we do helps us understand why Arthur acts the way he does, for one, but more to the point, why fatherhood is something so vulnerable for him. Knowing his experiences with his own father gives a lot of perspective. It makes one wonder if he ever compared himself to Lyle. Did he feel bad when he realized that he was just like his father, a criminal that wasn't present? Did he have to actively fight the cycle of abuse when he became a father? Did he grow to resent his father even more after the birth of his own son? These are questions that we'll never know the answer to, of course, but they're interesting to think about when it comes to Arthur's character. Now it's John's turn to have his childhood analyzed. Everybody clap! We know, based on the conversation with Bonnie McFarland, that John's father was an immigrant from Scotland, and his mother was a prostitute. He never got to meet his mother, as she died during childbirth, and his father died when he was only 8. And despite the short-lived relationship he must have had with his father, he talks about him rather kindly. He reminisces how his father would speak of his Scottish heritage, his disdain for the English. Though, when speaking with Jack, John admits that he barely knew his own father. It's hard to say how exactly John feels about his biological father, just because of the lack of information, but I think it's fair to say that it was probably a better relationship than what Arthur had with Lyle. But regardless of how good the relationship was, it doesn't really matter when both of his parents were taken from him at such a young age. That kind of loss isn't easy, and John talks about his life after their loss as if it was a pretty difficult period of time. And it probably was. He was sent off to an orphanage in which he lived rough until he decided to just run away at the age of 11. Surviving on your own on the streets isn't easy, but it certainly isn't any easier being 11, 12 years old. I've always attributed this lack of a parental figure as the reason why he struggles so much with fatherhood later on in life. Yes, he had a father when he was young, but it's hard to say how close they really were. If there was disconnect between John and his father, it's no wonder that John struggles to connect with his own son. He wasn't used to responsibility, especially for another life. He didn't really have the experience growing up with a father to use as a sort of basis to know how or how not to raise his own kid. Now, I want to note that everything we know about Arthur and John's fathers are purely word of mouth. We're only hearing about these men through their perspectives. And while I don't doubt their stories and experiences, it is important to note that there is a level of bias there. All I really mean to say is that we did not directly see any of these men interact with each other. So it's impossible to say what objectively went on, and there's nothing for us to sort of formulate our own opinions on. But we are afforded such a luxury with the two men that have positioned themselves as father figures to our two protagonists. This is an aspect that I feel is equally as important to Dutch and Hosea as it is to Arthur and John. The most important thing we need to establish right off the bat is the level of vulnerability present. And it's not only with Arthur and John. A lot of people in the gang are vulnerable for one reason or another. For some, it's the fact that they might be an orphan, or maybe just have a poor relationship with their parents. Or maybe they were young, perhaps even a child, by the time they were introduced into the life of crime. Both of these unfortunate situations are how Arthur and John find themselves entangled with Dutch and Hosea. When they lacked parental guidance in life, having someone like this who would swoop in and offer protection, education, and a sense of community, that would have been life-changing. And while I don't think that Hosea did this for any kind of predatory reason, I do think Dutch had his eye out for people who would see him in a fatherly mentor kind of way. Hosea seemed much more concerned with actually vetting the gang. He expresses worry and concern over certain people that have been let in. Dutch, on the other hand, has no problem with letting people in who have clear vulnerabilities so long as they are loyal to him. Suffice to say, our protagonists were nothing short of vulnerable, perhaps mostly because they were literal children. Arthur was 14 when he found himself entangled with the Vanderlyn gang, and John was only 12. While the gang wasn't quite the infamous, violent, wanted in 5 states gang we knew it as in 1899, they were still criminals doing criminal activity. Unfortunately, these two, and a lot of people in the gang, were already accustomed to a life of crime by the time they were children, so it doesn't necessarily faze them when two outlaws take them in. The safety, as it were, comes from the fact that they were offered protection. It comes from Dutch and Hosea taking these poor, orphaned, neglected children and teaching them how to read and how to shoot a gun. That acknowledgement, that removal from a situation in which they are in far more danger, is already more than their actual fathers have done for them. And what more choice does a child have in a situation like this? Why would you go back to isolation and danger when there's two men offering you salvation? It's honestly no wonder that the lines between father figure and mentor would begin to blur. And we see that most prominently with Arthur throughout the course of the second game. While he doesn't write a ton about his dynamic with Dutch and Hosea, we do get some insight into Arthur's opinions when we look at his journal. It's within these pages that we get thoughts like, I love Dutch like a father, but in many ways, I love Hosea even more. And once he's diagnosed with tuberculosis, Arthur writes his racing, confused thoughts down in his journal, where he correlates Dutch, Hosea, and his father all in the same line of thinking. These men all occupy the same general role in his mind, whether he realizes that or not. In the same way he holds on to that photo of his father, he carries a scrap of newspaper from the first robbery that he committed with Dutch and Hosea, as well as a photo of the three of them from years years ago. I don't think it matters if the memory is necessarily good or bad. I just think that Arthur is a very sentimental person, at least more sentimental than he leads on, considering he tends to keep mementos from his past. And speaking of, he will often reminisce on the way that Dutch and Hosea raised him and how they shaped him into a proper outlaw. Kind of a strange thing to, praise your father figures on, but I guess nothing about their bond is necessarily normal. In the optional fishing section of The New South, the three will talk fondly of the old days, recalling a time when things were much simpler. This is probably the closest we'll ever get to seeing how Arthur, Dutch, and Hosea interacted with each other before the events of this game. But of course, that's not the only time we see them bicker and poke fun at each other.
Arthur, you're in that one. Bring Hosea. I know you two like to talk about the good old days and what's gone wrong with old Dutch.
All right, Charles, you and me hold the thing up while you try and put the wheel back on, Arthur.
You still strong enough to hold up a wagon?
Shut up.
I'm just saying.
Well, say less.
This'll end soon.
Damn right it will.
Constipated as usual.
We'll need something.
I ain't playing dress up. You know how I feel about that.
Of course you're not. You're a clown's idiot brother.
Hosea, please.
I'm the clown. You're the idiot. Just look sad and keep quiet. Even you can do that, Arthur.
I never knew you were quite so good at running away, Arthur.
Well, I never knew age had slowed you down quite so much.
Whether it be through camp interactions or actual conversations, there's a lot of little tidbits that were fed that showcase their dynamic. References to past events, recalling each other's failures, pointing out each other's behavior and the subsequent changes. Especially in the first half of the game, Arthur is adamant about reassuring Dutch that his loyalty is no question, that he will forever and always ride alongside him. He even seems offended when Dutch suggests otherwise. Hosea and Dutch's superiority, both as mentors and as long-running members of the gang, is something that Arthur upholds strongly. It's almost certainly a product of the time period, but I also think that it showcases how much respect he has for them. It comes from a place of understanding and wholeheartedly believing that these two saved his life and he is internally indebted.
Dutch saved me. Saved most of us. That's why we need to stick by him through this.
And though this closeness is less prominent with John, that doesn't mean it isn't present. Like Arthur, John was taught to read, taught to survive, taught to shoot a gun from these two men. He was quite literally saved from death by Dutch. And while John does recognize what good Dutch has done for him, he still struggles with doubt. It's hard to say when exactly the doubting started or what exactly caused it, or when exactly it became so prominent. I'd wager a bet that most people would say it's the Blackwater Ferry incident, which makes sense. But I would wager that some of it probably comes from his year-long absence he took. Yes, he lived 12 formative years without the gang's influence, but by the time he left, he had spent an entire decade with Dutch and Hosea. And while we don't know where he went or what exactly he got up to while he was gone, being separated from the men who had taken him in, influenced him, and so deeply ingrained this ideology into him, and essentially groomed him for the sake of said ideology, there's a good chance that the distance he got in that year probably would have put things in a new perspective for him. Now, obviously, it didn't deter him too much, as he had no problem returning to the gang, but I wouldn't be surprised if this newfound freedom and the perspective he got from it, coupled with what he witnessed on the Blackwater Ferry, is what contributed to John's more vocal doubts about his mentor. Now, I do want to circle back to John as a father for just a second. As we discussed in that chapter, Dutch and Hosea are among the few that are vocal about John's neglect towards Jack. It really does feel like a father scolding his child to man up and take responsibility. You know, I raised you better than this, I know you're not stupid, so quit acting like it.
You're not as dumb as you act, John Marston.
Don't you be an arrogant son of a bitch, John. You're better than that. Love gets us all in the end. You be grateful it got you.
And when Jack is kidnapped later on in the story, Dutch and Hosea are two of the big forces that work to get him back. Now, I would say that Dutch's motivations here are convoluted at best, but that's a different discussion to be had. Hosea, though, is very adamant about Jack and his safety. He seems just as emotional as the boy's parents, which makes sense when you consider the fact that he's the one that's teaching this boy how to read, and he tries to keep the kid calm despite all the chaos that his life is. Like we mentioned before, Hosea even urges John and Abigail to leave the gang and prioritize the safety of their family first. He doesn't demand that they stay loyal and go down with the sinking ship. He makes it a point to prioritize the safety of a child who should not be surrounded by dangerous criminals. And while I think there's some complexity to why, as there's a lot of factors that play into the gang's downfall, it shows that Hosea has genuine care and respect for John's family. Going back to Dutch, despite John's hesitance and doubts, there's a supposed favoritism that a few people in the gang bring up. Both Arthur and Bill directly accuse John of being Dutch's favorite.
Everyone thinks that you're Dutch's pet.
His pet?
Yep. Like a dog or a cat. You're his favorite.
John doesn't get as much criticism as the other gang members. John gets to take it easy. John doesn't have as many expectations to meet. John doesn't have as many chores and busy work as we do. He's Dutch's pet or prize pony or whatever else they refer to him as. At one point, Arthur points out how no one else would have been welcomed back into the gang after leaving for an entire year, let alone welcomed back with open arms. And he seems rather keen to remind John that he was once favored, and look at where he is now. He's now the one stuck doing errands and doing dirty work. So while there might be some kind of preference in the way that Dutch treats John, Arthur, at the very least, seems to have reason to believe that this favoritism won't last forever. Like we've discussed multiple times now, Arthur's gripes with John are pretty multifaceted, but I do think that at least part of it comes from this comparison and favoritism between sons, which leads me into the big thing about this father-son dynamic, specifically pertaining to Dutch, the usage of the word son.
Son, 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 son.
We see Dutch refer to both Arthur and John as son throughout the course of the second game. He uses it when referring to some of the other members as well, Sean, Lenny, Kieran. The point I want to make is the difference between using that term with men he's wrangled in that just happen to be younger than him versus the men that he has taken in as children and essentially raised. I will try to keep this on topic as best I can, but I fear I may veer into the conversation about Dutch and his manipulation, so just bear with me. The usage of the word son by Dutch seems very deliberate because of how it's used. We see this word used most often when Dutch is trying to put emphasis on the loyalty of the gang, or trying to emphasize how important it is that the gang stick together. You know, when he's trying to reinforce this idea of solidarity and loyalty that the gang should have. Now, I don't want to ignore the fact that Dutch has also used the term brother to refer to both Arthur and John, but the word brother usually indicates some kind of equal standing. That word implies that Dutch sees these men as his equal, regardless of his standing as the gang's leader, that they have the same capabilities as brothers in arms. He seems to use this word when he's reassuring his men that they are equals and that he does care, and that he's doing what he's doing for their benefit. But the word son implies some kind of imbalance. This could be as simple as Dutch's age, or it can relate to his role as a father figure and their place as sons. Using that word is just subtle reinforcement that he is above them. It subtly reestablishes himself as the superior. It just depends how. And when he uses that word while also preaching about loyalty and faith, it becomes a manipulation tactic. I also want to point out that Dutch uses this word a lot when speaking with eagle flies. We'll dive into their dynamic in the next chapter, just you wait, but the usage of the word son is very deliberate. He uses it damn near every time he talks to that guy. He gets in Eagle Flies' head and draws the boy away from his father, which is a rocky relationship that Dutch knows is barely hanging on by a thread. He spurs the man on and even compliments his reckless behavior. It's like he knows that Eagle Flies just wants some form of approval from a mentor figure. It's honestly just pretty gross. This is one of many ways that Dutch pushes for unwavering loyalty. What started as an altruistic act of taking these kids off the streets and offering them protection became a way for Dutch to groom them into lackeys, and Arthur became his shining achievement in that regard. The moment that comes to mind is a scene at the beginning of the game between Arthur and Charles, in which the former explains his relationship with Dutch. Arthur is very proud to run with Dutch and Hosea, and his loyalty is no question. It can't be, because, like he says, Dutch saved him. And that fondness is what drives the entire main story of Red Dead Redemption 2. Arthur refusing to understand or even acknowledge Dutch's behavior, and then the subsequent realization after so much loss and turmoil. Even John, despite his doubts and more vocal hesitance about Dutch's plans, can't get rid of the ingrained idea of loyalty. It's a pretty heartbreaking thing to witness. The story of these two boys groomed into believing this fraudulent, violent man's crazed ideas about the world. They didn't know how to doubt the men that raised them, because that meant being faced with the difficult reality that the men who replaced their fathers weren't all that better. In the end, both John and Arthur were betrayed by a man that they could have considered to be a father figure, or at the very least, a mentor in the same fashion a father would have been. The same man that took them off the street and taught them how to read was the same that ended up pointing his gun at them. And when he was confronted with his decisions, with the way that he failed both of them, he walked away like a coward. And unfortunately, Dutch's poor influence was not contained within the confines of the gang. Now, I can't speak to the accuracy in the way that these characters are written, especially during this time period, but for what little weight my white opinion holds, I will say that Rains Fall and Eagle Flies are two of my favorite characters in this entire game. Not only do I think that their story is an important observation of Native Americans and the way that white people treated them, especially at this point in time, and I do think that it's pretty important to talk about that topic when we get into stories and discussions of the Wild West, but I also think that Rains Fall and Eagle Flies parallel our protagonists pretty well. I honestly think it would be a disservice to leave them out of this conversation. By the time Chapter 6 comes around, a whirlwind of changes have hit our protagonist, and pretty much every member of the Vanderlyn gang. Of course, as our main character, we see some of those biggest changes with Arthur. There's a little bit of a debate here, depending on if you go high honor or low honor, but the main point stays the same. The gang barely resembles what it once was at the beginning of the game. And regardless of the honor route that you do take, one of the biggest changes that takes place is the dynamic between Arthur and Dutch. As we just pretty extensively discussed, the bond between Arthur and Dutch is very father-son-esque. Not good, mind you, but it does parallel a father-son dynamic. It's rife with power imbalance and manipulation that is all done under the guise of some twisted form of familial love. By the time we get to Chapter 6, and as becomes more evident the longer we play this chapter, that blind loyalty that we once saw from Arthur has now pretty much completely deteriorated. It's replaced with a frustration that's palpable from both parties. This bond that we once thought to be completely unbreakable has now fallen apart. And this is a direct parallel to what we know about the bond with Rains Fall and Eagle Flies. Now, we don't know the specifics of how exactly close the two were, but we know undoubtedly that Rains Fall cares very deeply for his son. The primary difference that they have is in their outlooks. The two have very different opinions about the actions that they believe they should take against the military and government that actively oppresses them. And the biggest change in the relationship between these two parties is a lack of respect that is felt from both sides. We just don't have enough information to know if Eagle Flies was as blindly loyal to his father the way that Arthur was to Dutch. But I actually find more similarities between Arthur and Rains Fall. Don't get me wrong, I do think it's important to note that both Arthur and Eagle Flies are the sons in their dynamic, and they are in a direct conflict with their father figure because of their perceived rebellion. They're disobeying orders and acting recklessly, and they're putting their nose where they've been told they shouldn't. The big difference, though, is in the way that the father figure responds. Rains Fall, arguably to a fault, is so determined to keep the peace that he takes little to no action against his son. No matter how strongly he feels, no matter how fearful he is that his son might do something dangerous, something that could endanger both himself and their group as a whole, he's very restrictive in his attempts to wrangle Eagle Flies in. He does little more than talking, which obviously falls on deaf ears, until he's pretty much forced to ask for outside help. But everything that he does comes from a place of love, desperation even, to keep his son alive and not incite any more problems with a force that is much stronger than either of them are. Dutch, on the other hand, it's very clear that peace is not a route that he is interested in taking, especially at this point. Instead, he gets argumentative and he ignores his sons as they start to question his mindset and question their loyalty. In fact, I'd argue that Arthur and John are more insistent in trying to keep the peace than whatever the hell Dutch is doing. They actually consider the women and children, the people in this gang who never asked to be in part of this internal feud that's going on. John finally is prioritizing the safety of his family over his loyalty to to Dutch. And all of that, being perceived as betrayal by Dutch, incites a lot of anger and annoyance in him. In numerous instances, he leaves the men who can be perceived as his children left for dead. There could not be a more colossal difference in the way that these two men carry themselves and interact with the people around them. With all of that being said, I want to expand a little bit more on this parallel that I see between Rainsfall and Arthur. While there's undoubtedly a sense of anger present, most prominently with Arthur, it's not so much that they have fury with their fellow man as it is just disappointment and fear. These two men are trying, in their own ways, to keep some semblance of peace with men that are just not interested in taking the peaceful route. They're both fighting losing battles. And while their goals and intentions are different, they're both trying to grapple with the fact that they are losing someone that they have cared deeply about for years. Their loved one has started to act very sporadically, seeking out this vengeance that will only lead to damnation to an entire group of people. Arthur and Rainsfall both try to reach out, insisting that there's a better way to go about all of this. They point out the danger and the lives at stake, but it's all to no avail. They're both too weak. This perceived weakness is one of only many ways that these two characters are perceived to be pretty similar. Arthur depended on, and he had expectations placed on him because of his strength. He was known and respected by Dutch for his determination, his skill both physically and with a firearm. When his sickness becomes too strong to ignore, constantly debilitating him, we see how these strengths are no longer present. Now, he might still shoot pretty impressively, but we are constantly shown how he can't exert as much physical force without coughing or nearly passing out. I'm not trying to say that he's like super fragile or like completely weak and needs to be coddled like a baby, because for having tuberculosis, he still does some pretty impressive feats. The man goes in a hot air balloon, for Pete's sake. But the main point is that the people around him have changed their perception of him. Even people that like Arthur and fight alongside him have changed their expectations of him because he's growing sicker. While we don't know exactly what the other Native Americans thought about Rainsfall before the conflict with the military and everything that goes on in Chapter 6, Rainsfall does openly talk about how different his people view him. He is also perceived as weak. He won't stand up and fight. He won't push back against the unfair treatment from the government and the military. Maybe, at one point in history, Rainsfall would have been a man to do all these things. He admits that at one time he fought a lot and he knew death well. But now, because he refuses to escalate this conflict, the perspective and the respect from his people have changed. In Chapter 4, upon formally meeting Rainsfall and Eagleflies for the first time, Arthur writes about the two, quote, "Father and son angry, father with an air of what exactly? Of something both impressive and frightening and kind about him. A great man, defeated by powerful and awful forces? I do not know, but his eyes, his very manner, spoke to me." Before he's even truly affected by his sickness, before the gang has completely fallen apart around him, he can already feel a sense of connection. It's foreshadowing, of course, but I find it pretty insightful that Arthur can already see he has some foundational connection with Rainsfall. He could already tell that he might have had more in common with Rainsfall than one might have thought. I'll get back to our main point now, but I really wanted to hammer in the similarities with these two characters' stories because I think it's really important. Like many things in these games, I think it's intentional and I think it serves a purpose. But anyway, I want to point out the more obvious fact that Rainsfall and Arthur are both fathers. In fact, Rainsfall is one of only few people that know that Arthur actually had a son. It's through their conversation, through their very specific dialogue choices, that you can learn this information for the first time. That's clearly a big deal. You could chalk it up to all the physical and emotional turmoil that Arthur has gone through at this point in time. Maybe he's just so tired and so drained that he's just opening up to the first person that will listen to him. But I think it's more likely that Arthur probably understands how similar he is to Rainsfall, and just how stressed that man must be in trying to save his son's life. Knowing firsthand what it's like to lose a child, through his own inaction, no less, I think Arthur sees that and it resonates with him. After this conversation, Arthur writes in his journal,
He's a man who, not so long ago, I would have found weak and pathetic. Now I see as wise and thoughtful and sensible.
not only giving us a sign that Arthur's perspective on life has changed, but that Rainsfall specifically is a man that he respects. It's part of the reason why he can, depending on your choices of course, get so involved and try to help. It harkens back to the way he bullies John for being a deadbeat dad in the earlier half of the game. It's difficult for Arthur to sit idly by and watch the disconnect between a father and son. And when Eagleflies does unfortunately pass away, we see that it hits Arthur pretty hard. It's one of the few times that we really see him get emotional and actually cry. He feels so bad, perhaps even guilty, that he offers to stay in Wapiti and help Charles move the reservation. And it's after Eagleflies' death that Arthur confronts Dutch and insists that the women and children in John's family be let go. While his priorities have been shifting a lot throughout this entire chapter, I think that this blatant betrayal, in Dutch's eyes, and this confrontation from a man that he never once questioned, goes to show how difficult it was to witness a father lose his son. Even though he barely knew Rainsfall and Eagleflies, he genuinely mourned and sympathized with them. And I think the situation with Rainsfall and Eagleflies hit him so hard because he understood both perspectives. He's already lost that battle on both fronts. Which brings me all the way back to the kicker of this discussion, which is Dutch's manipulation. We have talked at lengths of how John and Arthur have been the victims of a certain kind of manipulation that puts them in the position of sons to their father figures, most notably to Dutch. So for the sake of simplicity, and not repeating myself for the 1000th time, all I'll say is Arthur understands what it is like to be on the receiving end of Dutch's manipulation. Having recently opened his eyes to the lies in this facade that he's been told his entire life, I think it's fair to assume that the subject is a little touchy for him too. And this is where the similarities between him and Eagleflies start to appear. Like I mentioned before, these two have the connection of being the sons in their family dynamic. But what's most important is how being a son allows Dutch to work his infamous charm. Arthur is privy to it by now, but unfortunately, Eagleflies is ignorant to how Dutch works. I'm drawn to this quote from Arthur's journal. Quote, "Saw Eagleflies, the chief's son again. Dutch was captivated by him, turning on all his charm and confidence and seeming like a dangerous snake. What is wrong with him? Eagleflies is desperate and angry. The local regiment are tormenting him and goading him into a fight. Now Dutch is in his ear. This will be a disaster." Now, I'm not going to sit here and recount all of Chapter 6, but this conflict involving the military and the Native Americans is one of the big driving forces of this chapter. Dutch learns that Eagleflies is upset and frustrated with the government and the military, two big opponents that Dutch not only hates, but is an active enemy of. Dutch decides to take this frustration that these Native Americans have with the systemic oppression that they face and use it to his own benefit. Obviously, this is sort of the most over-the-top and dramatic way that he could have used another one's plight for his own benefit, but it is reminiscent of the way that he uses the members of his gang. They're lost, usually already targeted by the system, because they're orphans or criminals or just simply a minority. And by taking them in and fostering that anger, they become unwaveringly loyal. And he does the exact same thing with Eagleflies. It would be one thing to take the young man in and foster him in a more literal sense, like he did with some of the members of his gang, but Dutch doesn't even do that. He's more like a little devil on the shoulder of these vulnerable and angry men, egging them on and encouraging them to do increasingly more dangerous acts. He's drawing Eagleflies away from his father, playing into this idea that his father is weak, constantly reminding these young men that action must be taken and that their leader simply isn't doing enough. We've had plenty of examples of Dutch playing into people's emotions, but this is like the shining example of that. And, just like many times before, it is for his own personal benefit. It's reminiscent of the way that he treated our protagonists. He knew the frustrations that they felt as young orphans backed into a corner and failed by the system. Having John and Arthur, who he has fought to fight back against the system that failed them, on his side allows him to have loyal soldiers who will fight for him without question. And the same can be said for almost everybody in the gang. It benefits him to play into these people's emotions and keep them angry. He fosters their impulses and frustrations with the system that keeps them vulnerable. Dutch despises the American government in the way that it operates, so he can align himself with the interests of his gang. He can put himself in the shoes of the people that he expects to fight alongside him. But he really had no reason to despise the government or the military for any of the actions that they took against the Native Americans. Yes, in a moral sense, anybody would be upset about it, but Dutch didn't really care. He spurred on these young men, these vulnerable people that were just desperate for somebody to help them, someone who would understand their cause and fight alongside them, into fighting a force that they had no chance ever winning against, simply so he could get a distraction for something that he wanted to do. I don't really have a clever way to segue into this last part, but let me just draw up some parallels for you. Both Eagleflies and John are captured by the government thanks to a plan that Dutch heralds. Both men are then explicitly ignored by Dutch because going back to rescue them would be too risky, and he makes no attempt to break either of these men out when they are imprisoned. When Eagleflies is mortally wounded and actively dying, Dutch doesn't even acknowledge him, let alone even offer to take take the boy back to his father. And 2 separate times, we see Dutch leave Arthur for dead. The first time, he doesn't utter a word, merely walks away as a loose end ties itself up. The second time, he's too much of a coward to face the consequences of these actions and leaves Arthur as he prepares to take his final breath. Dutch's performative activism is an entirely different conversation that I've already spoken a little bit about. Shameless plug. The major point I'm trying to make here is that Dutch uses vulnerable people for his benefit, as he's convinced himself that he's some kind of freedom fighter who is targeted by the government for trying to reform the corrupt ways, because he advocates for the old America when things were free and fair. He thinks that the oppression he faces for choosing to be a criminal is anywhere near the same thing as the systemic oppression that a lot of these vulnerable people face. It's not, in case I need to spell that out for you. He will consistently lead these people into fights that none of them are ever going to win. But that didn't matter, because he had soldiers that were willing to die for a cause that they believed in, a cause that he pretended to care about. This behavior even extends into the first game, where when we get to 1911, we see that Dutch is still doing the same thing. He is still manipulating young Native American men into fighting the government for his cause. And while he's had people of all creeds in his gang following him, fighting alongside him, I think that there's a little bit of a trend in a lot of them. So with that, let's talk a little bit more about the other gang members and their fathers. Right off the bat, I just want to say I don't think that the topic of fatherhood is as important or prominent to the stories of some of the other characters that we see in the games, but I do still want to point it out for relevancy's sake and the fact that we are surrounded by the members of the gang for pretty much all of the second game. Some of these men had a father that was present and active in their lives. Others had a very poor experience with their father. Either way, I think the fact that the game lets us know what the relationships to their fathers were helps us understand their characters, even if it's only a little bit more. It might help explain some of the expectations that they have. It might explain why they act the way they do. It just gives us a little bit more insight into who these characters are. Let's start off with a positive note and talk about Lenny. Lenny is one of the few people that actually have a positive relationship with their father. Not only was Lenny's father active and present in his son's life, but Lenny cared enough about his father to avenge his death. And the consequences of that, risking his own life and his freedom, is what ends him in the Vanderlyn gang in the first place. We can find a letter in the camp that Lenny seems to have kept from his father. It's very heartfelt, describing how Lenny's father seems to have cared for and taught his son. Obviously, this means a lot to him, and we can assume it's one of the few things that he actually has to remember his father by. I think it's very intentional that Lenny is one of the only gang members that actually has a positive relationship with his father. Lenny is one of the kindest members of the gang, especially amongst the men. I often think about how willing he was to rescue Micah when that man was nothing but rude and offensive and condescending to him. That itself is just a huge sign of not only maturity, but how kind he is. He's educated and he's well read, thanks to his father. I also find it very fitting that Hosea is the one that urges Lenny to leave the gang and actively pursue a job as a lawyer. This man, who served as a father figure to a lot of other people, is able to see in Lenny what his own father saw, a potential that is far above what others expected of him. Another interesting interaction we see is the conversation between Dutch and Lenny concerning Evelyn Miller. We know that Lenny is well educated to know a fraud when he sees one, and I imagine he's probably the only gang member who actively puts up an argument against Dutch when it comes to this topic. Dutch concedes the argument, as he should, because he's spewing a bunch of bullshit, and he's spewing it against somebody who, again, is educated and well-read, someone who can point out every flaw and every hypocritical statement in all of that writing. But even though he concedes the argument and admits, "Oh, Lenny, you're just too smart for me," it's still very condescending in a way. It's very unfortunate that Lenny never got to live the successful life he was very capable of living, and ended up dying for a man who could never reciprocate what he gave. I want to leave off with a quote from his father's letter, because I think it's both very relevant and very heartwarming. "You have redeemed more than you know, or can ever know, or should ever be expected to bear." There's not really a fellow stand-up dynamic to explore, so forgive the slight tone shift from here on out, but I think the next best thing we can get is Sean and his father. Sean's father, I'm about to get bullied by Irish people, I'm sorry. Sean's father, Dara, was part of an Irish revolutionary group that fought for Irish independence. Because of the work that he did, he was targeted by the government for being an outlaw. His father was very involved in the political and humanitarian landscape of Ireland at the time. And I think that's part of why Sean is so proud of his heritage. He grew up with a father who fought against and opposed the government at every turn. And while, again, this might have labeled him as an outlaw in the government's eyes, it's not the same thing as, say, Arthur's father, who was just a petty criminal. Yes, Sean had a father who was constantly on the run and, again, targeted by the government, which no doubt would have put him in danger. But Sean clearly doesn't hold any contempt for his father. He talks about him often, and he talks about him like he was this genius who heralded a lot of wisdom. He talks about his father so much, in fact, that other members of the gang seem to groan and complain every time Sean brings him up.
And look at me now, in the gutter seat, back in business, boys. You know, my dad always used to say,
Not the dog, please. Not this again.
I don't think a man who didn't like his father or didn't at least respect the work his father did would do that. Sean is very eccentric. He's very proud of himself, very loud, very boisterous. He does not hide who he is. You learn who Sean Maguire is very fast, and you either love him or you hate him. And it makes sense that he'd be so proud. With a father who was a revolutionary and a political figure, of course Sean had an ego that was through the roof. Dutch often prides himself on being a revolutionary of sorts, of fighting to change the very foundation of America, of opposing the government so that it can go back to being free the way it used to be. I wouldn't say he's anywhere near as honest or successful as any of the revolutionaries that fought over in Ireland, but it's this revolutionary attitude that's familiar to Sean. Yes, he's young and he's reckless, but I think he allows himself to have that attitude because of how well connected he was to his father. That's also why his loyalty to Dutch and pretty clear respect for Arthur is so steadfast. He grew up hating government agents and law enforcement, and Dutch allowed him to truly flourish in that regard. Lenny and Sean aren't perfect, but they're certainly kinder than the others in a lot of regards. There's a sense of camaraderie with these two that we don't really get to see in the other members of the gang, especially with the people that are more standoffish or reserved. Whether or not their personalities can be attributed to their upbringing is kind of a debate in and of itself, but it's an interesting detail nonetheless. So let's talk about the members that served as opposing forces in these games. Javier, Bill, and Micah, for example. These three serve as antagonists to both Arthur and John. I think it's fair to say that Javier isn't as guilty as the other two, but he is quite literally an antagonist in the first game, so forgive me, I am grouping him in. The point I want to make with these three is, even though we don't know very much about their fathers, what we do know gives us a lot of insight into their behavior. We also know that with the three of them, it's not very pretty. Javier's father was a poor drunkard laborer who worked on a farm that was once owned by Colonel Allende's family. Even though the events of Red Dead 1 haven't happened yet, this tells us that Javier was poor and his family was oppressed, or at the very least kept in some kind of systemic oppression by the government. His family were unwillingly kept in a cycle of abuse due to the corrupt government. We really don't have any indication that Javier was very close with his father, but I'm sure seeing the mistreatment that his family faced was probably the biggest inspiration for Javier to become a sort of revolutionary / bounty hunter that he does. The same thing that ends him up in America in the first place. It's less of a direct influence from his father, but I still want to point it out. I think it's evident that his upbringing affected his outlook on life, and it's one of the reasons why he is so damn loyal to Dutch. Bill also doesn't talk much about his father, but the little bit of information he does share tells us that the man was a horrendous alcoholic. Bill even describes the man as having lost his mind. The thing that really gets me about Bill, and honestly would make me feel pretty bad for him if it wasn't for all the terrible shit that he does, is how heartbroken and sad and scared he sounds when talking about his father. He, like most of these men, doesn't really give us an indication on how close he was with his father, but his father was clearly present enough for Bill to have a very clear opinion of him. He talks about how afraid he is to ever follow in his father's footsteps, how scared he is to ever get the way that his father did and lose his mind in a similar sense. It's very sad to hear, but perhaps even sadder is that we do see Bill drink. And often, and he is nothing if not angry and belligerent most times. His father did influence him, but clearly not in a good way. Lastly, let's talk about Micah, everybody's favorite. There is a lot to say about that man, of course, but I will stay on topic for the sake of wrapping up this video. Micah was, presumably, abused by his father. Or, at the very least, he was surrounded by abuse and brought up in a very hostile environment. Hell, we hear from Micah's own mouth that his brother Amos was almost deliberately killed by their father. And in that same breath, Micah goes so far as to defend his father by calling Amos a weak coward. There's so many things that point towards this violent upbringing being what shapes and alters Micah's mind into acting the way that he does and treating people the way that he does, the outlook that he has on life. Obviously, being surrounded by violence and running with his father as a deplorable criminal would have affected him. He can say it didn't affect him and pretend that he was 100% willing all of the time, but that simply just isn't true. Any child would be affected by the childhood that Micah had. He is a victim stuck in a cycle of violence and abuse that goes back to, at the very least, his grandfather. For anyone else, it would be heartbreaking to hear. But being brought up that way doesn't excuse the way that he acts. I want to go back to his brother, Amos, and talk a little bit about him. Most importantly, I want to talk about this letter we can find addressed to Micah from him. Amos, despite being victim to the same unfortunate childhood, has gotten himself into a better situation. He has a wife and daughters who he clearly cares very deeply about. So much so that he explicitly says he would kill his brother just to keep them safe. I don't doubt that it was hard to leave that life in that cycle of abuse. Amos even writes in this same letter that despite the violence Micah is capable of, he still loves him. But it is possible to change, and Amos is proof of that. Clearly, Micah has allowed his father's influence and expectations to guide him. I also think, personally, that learning how to navigate a childhood like that is why he's so good at charming Dutch. He knows how men like that think and operate. He's been surrounded by them his entire life. He knows how to tell Dutch exactly what he wants to hear at all times. If his father taught him anything, it was how to survive as a deplorable criminal. Unfortunately, the cycle of violence is not something that is reserved for our antagonists, though. Jack Marston's story is perhaps the most explicit example of a cycle that these games show us. Now, granted, it is not a cycle of abuse the way that Micah Bell's story is, but it is a cycle nonetheless. Being surrounded by violence, especially as a child, isn't far off from being victim to it. Jack Marston, and where we see him in 1914 during the epilogue of the first game, is an entire conversation itself. I could make an entire video just on that alone, just discussing how the cycle of violence impacted him and led him to end up the way that he did. But for the sake of brevity, I will try to sum up my thoughts here as best that I can. It's not hard to understand that Jack ended up the way that he did because of the environment he was raised in. Being raised by outlaws and criminals, whether or not their violence and anger was directed towards him, is not a good situation for any child to be in. No, he wasn't toted along in the robberies or expected to be violent or intentionally put in harm's way, but Abigail talks often about Jack's behavior as a child, how moving constantly can't be good for him, or she's worried that his lack of a father figure will end up affecting him somehow. Arthur mentions that the gang is there to protect Jack, that all of the grown-ups have some sort of group obligation to make sure that he stays safe. And yet, even though it isn't done intentionally, he is at the scene of multiple traumatic events. He's kidnapped within the confines of the camp later on. Even putting the kidnapping aside, he witnessed a beheaded Kieran precede a shootout at Shady Belle. Quite frankly, impossible to imagine a 4-year-old being present at. But to be completely honest, no, we don't know how hard the events of his childhood impacted him. Obviously, we can sit here and we can speculate and we can understand that obviously just going through half of what he went through in the second game would have messed anybody up. But the only real big aspect of Jack's childhood that we have a good understanding of is John's presence, or lack thereof. It impacted Jack pretty heavily. While the growth of John and Jack's relationship is very important to the story of Red Dead Redemption 2, and it is a nice, reassuring thing to witness, their dynamic has shifted by the time the second game's epilogue comes around. To be fair, it is a big time skip. 8 years in which we don't know what exactly the Marston family got up to. We don't know for sure how present John was or how he even acted towards Jack. We don't know how involved he was for those 8 years. Presumably, he's been there the whole time, but he's been causing problems for his family. Harkening back to Abigail's concern for Jack, all of the moving and upheaval can't be easy on a kid. Not to mention all of the constant arguing and debating between his parents concerning John's constant return to his old way of life. Instability is a good way to sum up a lot of Jack's childhood, and that can lead itself to some kind of disconnect. There's a lot of reasons why the epilogue of the second game is uncomfortable. Just personally, watching this attempt at like awkward, bumbling disconnect between John and Jack gives me such secondhand embarrassment.
What are you doing?
Reading and playing with the dog.
You wanna go fishing or something?
Not particularly. I don't really like fishing.
John barely makes an effort to understand why Jack is so distant and quiet by the time that they work at the Geddes farm. And the violence that is brought to him, quite literally at his doorstep, is all thanks to his father's return to violence. And that leaves him shaken up and terrified, for good reason. I don't blame Abigail for leaving with their son in hopes of achieving a better life. Yes, it meant being separated once again, which I'm sure was not easy on Jack either. But to be fair, it was either be separated from the father who keeps returning you to violence, or possibly being a victim of said violence. I think any good mother would see that that's not really a choice. You know, you just kind of have to do it. It is nice to know that once Beecher's Hope is up and running, Jack is pretty excited to be a family again. Though it does seem like he's more excited to see the new house than actually see his father. There's certainly a disconnect between the two of them. Like we discussed before, John doesn't make much effort to involve himself in Jack's interests. Hell, he doesn't even really have many conversations with the boy at all unless he's ordering him to do something. There's a line that Jack says in the fishing mission that really sticks out to me. "Do you wish I was more like you?" It's the first insight we get that Jack doesn't feel like he's enough for his father. We'll delve into this thought a little bit more later, but for now, let's get into the Marston family as we see them in 1911. I think the best way to sum up John and Jack's relationship in the first game, especially with the context of the second game, is strained. Jack is no longer a naive little kid who might forgive his father's absence or just not be able to understand why his father isn't around. He's old enough to run things at the ranch, to help take care of things, to shoot a gun and hunt. He's old enough and responsible enough to know that he has to work for their lifestyle. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that 16 is the peak of maturity, and I don't think he necessarily needs to have all of the worries and responsibilities he does, but I do think that that's just an unfortunate product of both the time period and the life that they lived. I have always seen Jack as a very stressed child. He worries a lot at both ages 12 and 16. When one thing goes wrong, he's very frantic about the outcome. And it makes sense why. Like we said, his entire childhood was riddled with instability. Why wouldn't he think that one mistake might uproot his entire life? He thinks he has to learn how to shoot a gun on his own, because if his father does, he'll teach him just to run off again. He vocalizes his frustrations with John's parenting, or supposed lack thereof, saying, "You can't just decide to be a father when it suits you." Abigail even says at one point that Jack is like a kid growing up without a father. And it's clear that Jack understands, at least in the first game, that John left to deal with something that is much bigger than he can understand. He knows it's something that involved his old gangmates, the law, and a whole lot of hush-hush talk. But knowing the context of the second game, it makes his frustration with his father a lot more understanding. I see this as a boy who cried wolf situation. Every time the Marstons have had to move or relocate, or John has done something that has taken them back to the cycle of violence, he has claimed it's because he had no choice. How many times has he excused himself with that? How many times do we see in the epilogue of the second game that John uses that as an excuse?
I didn't have much of a choice. What choice did I have? What choice did I have?
John always had a choice, whether he wanted to realize it or not. But when he is left without a choice and the law literally kidnaps his wife and child, that claim finally rings true. He didn't have a choice in the first game, but that excuse doesn't work anymore. How many times has Jack heard his father say that? How many times has Jack witnessed his father's past, this tendency to fall back into his old ways, be excused with, "I didn't have a choice"? Obviously, the circumstances are different. Jack was forcibly held by Pinkertons after all. But I can understand why this claim of "I had no choice" would upset him so much. It is not something he wants to hear, even if it is true this time around. He says at one point, "Don't make no more promises, Pa. I've heard them all before." Now I want to circle back to this idea that Jack feels as though he isn't enough for his father. It's in the mission Spare the Love, Spoil the Child, in which Jack attempts to hunt a bear on his own, that we get arguably the best insight into the conflict between John and Jack. I mean, right off the bat, I just want to point to the very idea of this mission. Jack risks his life hunting a bear just to prove to his father that he is not some kid who needs to be coddled, to prove that he is worthy of his father's time. How sad is that? But it's the conversation they have on the ride home that really gets into the crux of the disconnect between the two of them. John scolds Jack for disobeying, which leads Jack to admit that he leaves on his own quite often, but John wouldn't know this because he's never around. And when John asks why in the world Jack would think he could hunt a grizzly bear on his own, Jack replies with this.
I was trying to prove myself.
Prove what? By getting yourself killed?
You're always telling me I read too many books, that I'm not a real man.
I never said that.
I just thought if I could do something you'd like, maybe you wouldn't go away again.
Not only is this an indication of the lack of communication between the two of them, but that tells us exactly why there is a disconnect. Now, I don't think John ever directly said, "You're not a man and you spend too much time reading," but we witnessed John, both in the epilogue of the second game and in the events of the first game, multiple times persuade Jack to stop reading so that they can go fishing or hunting, something that has John's approval. Later in the same ride, Jack says,
I don't know. I'd probably be dead.
You'd be a pile of bones right now.
What would you care? I'm just a nuisance to you anyway.
Jack thinks that being a son that his father isn't proud of is at least part of the reason why John leaves so often. That is so sad to think about. For what it's worth though, Jack does still seem to love his father. It doesn't come without its bickering and its frustration, but the boy still clearly cares enough to want to be a son that John is proud of. In the final mission of Red Dead Redemption, the conversation that the two of them have is actually pretty nice. John compliments Jack's work, reassures him that he'll turn the ranch into something nice someday. Jack seems genuinely happy to earn that praise by his father. They even joke about writing a novel about John, almost as if John wants to subtly reassure that he doesn't mind all of the book reading. And as this mission comes to its unfortunate conclusion, it's obvious that Jack understands the risk that his father is under, and he doesn't want the man to die. As much frustration was present in their dynamic, he still cared very deeply for that man. And that's why I think that the true ending to the first game is so important. The fact that Jack risks his life dueling an ex-government agent just so he can avenge his father is a huge deal. That is incredibly indicative to how he really felt about John. A man that truly despised his father probably wouldn't have done that. Now, Jack has his gripes with John, and he has every right to be frustrated with the way that he was brought up. But when we compare Jack's thoughts about John to, say, the way that Arthur talks about Lyle, the difference there is night and day. Hell, when he's in combat, Jack will throw around his father's name with pride.
I'm John Marston's boy. What does the name Marston mean to you? My name's John Marston, Jr. I'm my father's son.
Even if he does admit that his father's probably burning in hell.
Looks like I'll be joining my pa in hell.
And he makes jokes about being a Marston after he takes a life.
What can I say? I wasn't brought up very well. You think I'm bad? You should have met my father. Blame my parents. I do. I'm a Marston, you fools. Yep. I'm a Marston, all right.
I still wouldn't say that he talks about his father with any kind of disdain. Hell, if you kill a bear, he will proudly proclaim that this one's for you, Pa. Sure, there's a few disgruntled remarks about having a bad role model and being raised bad and his father being a killer, but he's not wrong. You can't blame a man for speaking the truth. Like I said at the beginning of this chapter, I could make a whole separate video on the first game's epilogue and the conversation here about the cycle of violence that Jack unfortunately falls into. He is very much a product of his environment, as sad as that is to say. It's hard to say how he would have turned out had his father been more present, or had he never grown up in a gang in the first place. Maybe he still would have ended up okay and led a normal life if John would have shaped up in 1907. Unfortunately, though, none of these are the outcomes that we got. But what we did get remains one of the most complex and fascinating relationships in the entire series. Honestly, I could have delved into a few more conversations and broken down a few more interactions, but I'm sure y'all get the point. I guess this is where I will finally start wrapping up my thoughts and give you guys the conclusion I'm sure you've been waiting for. I'm sure you all can tell that I have thought about fatherhood and the dynamics that are present with all of the characters in these games a lot. I tend to overthink a lot of the things that happen in these games though, so don't be surprised. I just find fatherhood specifically such an interesting topic in these games because of how present it is. Like I said, it can come up in even the littlest of interactions, even in the tiniest of details, because fatherhood is something that can directly impact you for the rest of your life. It can show itself in every conversation you have. It can show itself in the way that you treat people and the outlook that you have in life. And like we discussed, we see that with almost every character that we interact with. I definitely don't think I'm reinventing the wheel or pointing out anything that hasn't been pointed out before. Again, I think fatherhood is one of the big shining examples in these stories, seeing as, again, the first game has a lot to do with fatherhood as it ties into the very foundation of the plot. But I wanted to have a bigger discussion with you guys, A, because I wanted to talk a lot, and B, because, again, I find it interesting. To everybody who stuck around to this ending, thank you so much. I cannot believe you actually listened to me talk for that long. That's insane. But I do appreciate it. I don't know how often I'll be posting stuff or how often I'll have whatever you want to call this. But if it is something people want to see, if it is something people are interested in, if this does get some kind of traction and people are actually interested in what I have to say, then by all means, let me know. Okay, my voice is fried. I'm tired. I think I'm gonna go. Stay safe, take care of yourself, and I'm sure I'll be back to talk about more bullshit soon. Bye!